Webcast. This is Manjeet Kripalani, Executive Director of Gateway House. This is the third episode of our weekly webcast meetings. And today we're going to talk about a subject which is on everybody's lips, and this is Chinese investments in India. Last week, the Commerce Ministry issued a press note which restricted certain FDI from coming into India without government permission, not from the automatic route. In particular, they talked about border countries, and we know what that means. It means China. Gateway House has been researching Chinese investments in India for a very long time. In fact, we're researching Chinese investments in our neighborhood, and our map on Chinese investments in India was published in February. It is a detailed map on the kind of Chinese money that is coming into India's startup sector, which is our most vibrant sector. And many of these numbers have been quoted by government and by the press so far. So I'm going to start. We've got three experts with us. One is Amit Bhandari, who is the author of the map. Amit is our energy fellow, and he will answer very specific questions on the startup. The second is Blaise Fernandes. Blaise is on our board, and he is also a co-author of the map, in particular on Chinese applications, Chinese apps and Chinese hardware. And we have with us Ambika Khanna, who is our senior researcher for international law. Ambika has written about how other countries have enacted similar legislation. So I'm going to start first with, the way we're going to work this, we'll have about 15 minutes with our speakers, and then 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience for about 15-20 minutes. It's short, really about half an hour. So let's go ahead. Amit, can we see you?
Yes.
Can we start with you? So Amit, this China's large presence in India's startup sector, how did that happen? Why did we need this policy change in the first place?
So, Manjeet, we need to look at the Chinese FDI in India and what sectors it has gone into. So, our study at Gateway House has identified about $6.2 billion of official FDI that has come in from China. And this number is clearly an underestimate because it doesn't factor funds routed via Singapore and Mauritius. Now, our study indicates that bulk of these investments have gone in India's startup sector. And we were able to identify 93 Indian startups with a Chinese investor on board. There are 30 Indian startups which are considered to be unicorns, and 18 of them have a Chinese investor on board. Now, there are two categories of investors here. The first category is Hong Kong-based private equity funds like Hillhouse, CBH, and Ward Ferry. These are your traditional funds which are looking for a profitable exit at some point. The second category is where the concerns begin. These are companies like Alibaba and Tencent. And now let us be clear, China is not a market economy, it is state-backed capitalism. And companies like Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent are at the vanguard. These companies want a firm foothold in the Indian market, and for which they are willing to absorb several years of losses. So many of the big investments they have are losing money heavily with no route to profitability. So multiple issues are coming up. First, do we want India's future economy to be an appendage to China's state-owned capitalism? Second, if some firms have access to endless streams of equity, it spoils the market for everybody else. And finally, there is the issue of data security and of Chinese influence via their investments in media sector.
So Amit, I'm going to move right over to Blaise. Blaise, you have written about Chinese apps that have been downloaded by Indians in large numbers. TikTok is bigger than YouTube, and it's very, very popular. India is the biggest market. Why are Chinese apps so enticing?
Manjeet, number of reasons. Hi, Manjeet, number of reasons. The first one being is a number of these apps are made keeping in mind emerging economies, okay, and that's the part of their digital Silk Route. What's enticing about these apps is they work on very low bandwidth. You don't require very heavy bandwidth. The second part is they've got great interfaces. The third part is they have interactive features like TikTok. It has a lot of interactive features. Easy to use, no major hassles on registrations. You don't need credit card details like a number of the other apps, kind of require your credit card details. So it's enticing because of all these factors put together. and therefore it has great penetration in India.
And there is another one, also Chinese hardware comes with these apps inside it. And so there's really no escape. Once you're in, it's like Hotel California, you can't get out.
Absolutely. So you're spot on there, Manjeet. Given the fact that the Chinese have a huge penetration in the smartphone market in India, these apps are embedded. So it's like a marriage perfect. It's like, perfect culmination of their digital Silk Route plan into India.
Terrific. So Amit, tell us a little bit about these startups. Why are these Chinese startups able to penetrate into India so well? Do we not have enough people giving money to our own startups?
So that actually is one of the issues. If I'm an Indian startup and I'm looking for a big ticket funding, say 25 or $50 million or more, then there are actually very few Indian options that I have at the moment. So by necessity, I have to go for foreign funders, and there are 4 or 5 pools of capital. There are American investors led by Sequoia. There is, of course, SoftBank and Japan. There are the Hong Kong-based private equity funds, Naspers from South Africa. And finally, there are the mainland China-based companies. Now, the difference is that most of these other investors are private equity funds, which are at some point looking for an exit. So they are concerned about the profitability of the investment. When an operational company like an Alibaba or a Tencent invests in a startup, they are looking for a long-term market presence. So they would be willing to take losses for several years just so that they can ensure they are the last man standing. In a way, you can actually call it predatory pricing, because many of the investments that we have seen are actually not making money, and they seem to be unlikely to make money in the foreseeable future.
Thanks. And I'm going to move over to Ambika quickly, and let's discuss. India is not the first country to enact these laws, Ambika. Other countries have done it before. The United States has strengthened some of its laws only very recently, but so have other countries. Can you tell us something about it?
Yes. So to begin with, the US was one of the first countries to actually create what is called the Committee on Foreign Investments in the US. This was done in 1988. This is an interagency committee within the government that reviews foreign investments on the grounds of national security. So over the years, this CFIUS has evolved, and in the last 2 years in particular, the CFIUS has expanded its scopes to even cover strategic investments made by China. So for example, as of date, 4 Chinese transactions out of 5 have been blocked by CFIUS because there was sufficient evidence to show that the technology will be misused by China. So for example, the CFIUS recently blocked a Chinese company from investing in an American company that manufactures semiconductors because it was able to establish that the Chinese investor will be using it for military purposes in their country. So similarly, Germany also in 2018 and 19, they enacted a law where it recognized the risks that are associated with allowing Chinese investments in Germany. It started with China's investment in Daimler. So it thereon reduced the threshold of non-EU investments in German companies from 25% to 10%, particularly in critical sectors such as energy, defense, key technologies, and media. It also, what was interesting was it introduced a veto power, wherein they could veto any incoming FDI. So apart from the US, apart from Germany, there's Australia, which has just recently created a pan-sectoral barrier, given the current pandemic, on any proposed FDI in light of concerns on predatory acquisitions by foreign investors. Also to say, the EU has also created a framework for the EU nations where they screen incoming investments. So this essentially allows a free flow of information between EU countries, and it makes it easier for countries to raise concerns on specific investments. So in March 2020, last month, the EU broadened the scope of this particular regulation and applied it across sectors without any thresholds, which effectively allows a scrutiny of even low-value strategic investments. Apart from these countries, there's Spain and there is Canada and there's UK, which has similarly incorporated these laws within their domestic laws. So what is it that India can do? So the FDI note is the first step in protecting our economy from predatory acquisitions. But there are a few other things that we think India and the policymakers should consider. The first is we should see if national security should be a ground on which India controls its investments under the FDI policy. Secondly, in furtherance to the first point, policymakers should consider creating a body such as the CFIUS, which will be an interagency body, consisting of members from different departments of the government, such as the Ministry of Commerce, which had the DPIIT, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the National Security Council, the Ministry of External Affairs, and the Ministry of Finance. This body should suo motu on its own, review or monitor or even investigate incoming investments in strategic sectors such as technology and media. This should ideally have the power to call out even existing investments and including in those investments that have come in through the government route, which means that if an investment has already got the government approval, but 2 years later, if the committee feels that that the technology or the investment or the investment product can be misused, then this particular body can call out that investment and create a barrier thereon. Further, our recommendation is that this committee should also monitor non-controlling investments. So where there is a non-controlling interest in investments in two sectors in particular, critical technology/infrastructure, or any area where there is sensitive personal data exchange. This is critical as of now because the value of investment could be low, but the strategic value for the investor could be very high. This is exactly what Amit was explaining a few minutes ago. Lastly, our last point is that while the press note currently covers the FDI, the foreign portfolio investment, which is controlled by the Securities and Exchange Board of India, we expect some clarification from them similar to the lines of what the Ministry of Commerce has done in the current FDI note, wherein it'll close the loop on creating a first line of check on Chinese investment.
Thank you, Ambika. So, Amit, this looks like there will be absolutely no light between what China can do and what India will allow them to do, or what countries will allow them to do. So this is not new. Remember, the Chinese have been buying ports and infrastructure, and now there is the whole issue of Huawei, which because of the pandemic has now speeded up and made it very urgent for countries not to allow China to just run riot into their key investment areas. So then, who is going to fill this vacuum at this point? We've just seen the investment, with Mark and Mukesh, Facebook and Jio. Is this going to help to build some sort of ecosystem for India, or is this very early? What are we going to see? So, and Blaise, I'd like you to follow up with that too.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amit.
Yeah, so there are, initially I had mentioned that there are 4 or 5 different pools of capital which are investing in Indian startups. So only one of these pools, which is the Chinese pool, is really being affected by the press note. The SoftBank funds, Sequoia funds, Naspers, these are all untouched. And even within the Chinese funds, if we look at the intent of the note, which is to really stop strategic sectors from being overrun, then I think the Hong Kong-based private equity investors are not really going to fall foul of the press note as well. So that really leaves us with Alibaba and Tencent kind of investors who are probably going to face additional scrutiny. So most of the funds are going to remain untouched, 1. 2, I think we also need to relook at the role that some of these companies are playing by providing too much equity. So many of the investments, for example, Paytm or Oyo or Ola, are running into heavy losses, running into thousands of crores. So this is really predatory pricing. These companies are not profitable. They may not have a route to profitability, and they may actually be making other companies which are run more conservatively and which have a better chance of being viable. They are actually hurting those companies as well. So probably it may not be such a bad idea that some of this equity should actually come under scrutiny. And finally, as you mentioned, the Facebook Reliance deal, probably Reliance might be one of the Indian companies that can create its own ecosystem and become a financier of large size deals as well.
Thank you. Blaise, would you like to talk about Mark and Mukesh?
Yeah, Manjit, I think at the end of the day, investments are needed in the digital ecosystems in India, given the fact that, as long as they're coming from countries which have a liberal democracy, have values, have strong institutions like the DOJ, FCC, or, in Europe, you have the European Union, which has regulatory bodies. And I think India is only going to be welcoming and rolling out the red carpet to companies that have responsibilities, companies where we can trace somebody in case of a default of any security concerns of national interest. I think compliance, companies which respect compliance, and companies that are in a black hole will always not be welcome.
Yeah. So we know where to find Mark Zuckerberg should anything happen, right?
Absolutely.
That's That's the key. And talking about the ownership issues, Ambika, the last question to you. The Indian government has now fully been made aware of issues of beneficial ownership. It began as a way to find out who was holding the black money, but now it has become a strategic issue for India for beneficial ownership to be fully embedded into our laws and into our systems. Can you explain to our audience what that means?
Yes. So beneficial ownership essentially means that there is an ultimate beneficiary which creates one or more entities under it, which then makes an investment in X country. So this is often done through creating what we call special purpose vehicles, which are usually created in tax-friendly jurisdictions, supported by complex holding structures, thereby making it very difficult to trace who the ultimate beneficiary is. So this is the model that is often adopted by Chinese companies, which are state controlled, but where the identification of the ultimate beneficiary, which is often the state itself, is difficult to determine. So it is this state control of critical technology in particular that is of countries to across the world. And this is the reason why we're seeing different countries create protectionist legislations in order on the grounds of national security. So in furtherance to this, we should expect stronger disclosure norms in the future, which target ultimate beneficial owners, especially arising from China and Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you.
Manjit,
So
I just want to touch upon, Manjit,
absolutely.
I just want to touch upon the security aspects of these entertainment apps. So, we had a situation last week where where a lab in Delhi actually discovered that there were close to 20,000 clips which could have triggered off sectarian violence in India. Now, what's happened is America was quick to latch on to this where TikTok is concerned. Two senators have actually passed a bill that TikTok will not be used by any government employees on government devices. The second part that I want to bring to your notice is all these apps, the TikTok app is moderated and the content filtering is happening out of China. TikTok has promised the American government that they're going to have what they call a filtering center based out of California. I think that's needed for security in India because at the end of the day, you need to kind of filter what's going on to these apps. Again, in terms of security, currently India has an ecosystem of 400 million smartphone users. By 2023, most reports say we're going to have another 400 million added to it. What happens when these 400 millions come on board? Their educational levels, their socio-economic levels are not as the first 400. Border states, sectarian violence, and when Chinese companies are investing now in content creating companies, be it Ghana or be it MCX, that's now they're going to create content so they can put the editorial out.
Yes.
The third factor I'd like to bring is UC Web, which is a browser. They are putting out the Chinese version of the Indo-China history, Indo-China war history.
Yes.
These are the things that we need to be careful in terms of security.
Well, Blaise, you are the guardian of India's IPR, of our soft power, but clearly China has learned very well how to weaponize its soft power. And with the world becoming ever more digitized, especially now after the pandemic, when everything is on your smartphone, including trying to find out who the next corona affected person next to you is, this is an issue.